Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. It is an absolute honor this morning to stand before you to introduce one of Barnard's very own, Anna Quindlen, a proud member of the class of 1974. And I guess as I begin to read her introduction, I should say who I am. I'm Avis Hinkson, a proud member of 1984. And we are so excited to participate in this talk across campus with Anna Quindlen. Anna Quindlen is a novelist and journalist whose work has appeared in fiction, nonfiction, and self-help bestseller lists. On our campus, she is perhaps best known as trustee emerita and chair emerita of the Barnard College Board of Trustees. A trailblazer in the newsroom, Quindlen was one of the first women to write for the New York Times op-ed page. Her groundbreaking and long-running Times column entitled Public and Private won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992. While she is a columnist at the Times, she also won a Pulitzer Prize and published 2 collections, Living Out Loud and Thinking Out Loud. Her Newsweek columns were collected in Loud and Clear. A major best-selling author in both fiction and nonfiction, Quindlen's A Short Guide to a Happy Life has sold over 1 million copies to date, while her novel, Black and Blue, was an Oprah Book Club selection. She is an author of 7 novels, Object Lessons, One True Thing, Black and Blue, Blessings, Rise and Shine, Every Last One, and now, Still Life with Breadcrumbs. Her memoir, Lots of Candles, Plenty of Cake, published in 2012, was a #1 New York Times bestseller. Her latest novel, Still Life with Breadcrumbs, is a story of the changing dimensions of a woman's life. We are excited to hear from her this morning, and so pleased to welcome our friends from across the university to join us. Anna, thank you for being with us this morning, and thank you all for coming to Barnard.
Thank you so much. Isn't this a fabulous space? I love the Diana Center so much. I'm hoping that we can spend at least half of our time this morning in a question and answer session. I've had a pretty peripatetic career, and some of you may be interested in hearing about journalism or current affairs. Others of you may be interested in hearing about fiction writing, and some of you may have gotten shut out of Eric Foner's talk about Lincoln. So I think the more that we can talk among ourselves, the better off we may be. But before that, I'd like to talk a little bit about a subject that seemed to me to be particularly apropos in this, my 40th reunion year, and to start with a rhetorical question. So what kind of woman marks her 60th birthday by publishing a memoir about aging, then follows that up with a novel whose heroine is a woman of a certain age? The obvious answer is a crazy woman, right? Someone who hasn't gotten the memo that aging is off-putting, not interesting, not grabby, not sexy. Or, in my own defense, a lifelong reporter who saw a story and went after it. The story of how aging in America has changed over the course of our lifetime. Let me start with one simple fact. In the year I was born, 1952, the average life expectancy of an American was 68. Yeah, hard to believe, right? As we all know, today it is topping 80. So that just during my lifetime, we've gained 12 years. 12 years is a long time, and how we're managing it and what we're doing with it is a really, really good story. However, here's what happens when you raise the question of getting older at a dinner party or a restaurant table or out with your friends. The moans start, the sighs, the eye rolls. So-and-so had a hip replacement. Oh, my best friend, she has tennis elbow. My eyes are disintegrating, my feet hurt, and let's not even talk about buying a bathing suit. But what I found out as I was working on Lots of Candles, Plenty of Cake is that if you push people a little harder, if you ask them what's really so terrible about getting older, once they get past the crepey neck, everyone winds up admitting that actually they're happier now than they were when they were younger. They feel as if they've settled into their own skins, even if their skins have lots of sun damage. In fact, I found this Gallup poll of 340,000 people that showed that I was right about this, that we get more contented as we age. They started out with respondents at 18 who felt really good about themselves, which was inevitable because at 18 you know nothing. And then as the years went by, people became less and less satisfied with their lives until you got to 50. And as soon as you got to 50, there was this upward trajectory that continued well into the 80s. As people in this survey got older, they reported that their anger, their stress, their sadness all declined. Maybe if we think of life as a job, most of us feel like by 50 we've finally gotten good at it. I think that feeling goes double for women, and the reasons why are clear just by talking to us. We all started out pretending, trying to adjust our throttle to some generally accepted notion of femininity. In her commencement address to the graduating class of Barnard College in 2010, which I just saw on the list of the best commencement addresses ever put out by NPR, Meryl Streep said that the characterization of the pleasing girl she created in high school was the hardest role she ever played. She told the students, "I adjusted my natural temperament, which tends to be slightly bossy, a little opinionated, a little loud, full of pronouncements and high spirits, and I willfully cultivated softness, agreeableness, a breezy, natural sort of sweetness, even shyness, if you will, which was very, very, very effective on the boys." Well, as most women would tell you, that act took its toll, as subterfuge and self-denial tend to do, and we all paid with a constant internal dialogue of criticism. Not smart enough, not pretty enough, not a good enough mother, not a good enough professional. There was an entire Greek chorus out there chiming in, a Greek chorus made up of magazines and advice books and alleged friends who insisted they were telling us only for our own good. The problem was that the chorus can't ever make up its mind. The messages range from self-sacrifice to self-promotion, from abstinence to sexual freedom. The only constant was that somehow we all needed to be more than we already were. And yet even more was never enough. The only good thing you can say about this sort of nonsense is that at a certain age we learn to see right through it, and that age isn't now. Because without the help of self-help books or inspirational speeches, we came to understand that we are absolutely enough. Cellulite is not a character defect. At 60, you can look all that superwoman stuff in the face and say to yourself, "Oh, please." We are done with the perfection complex. That's a punishing drumbeat that has driven so many of us for so many years. I realized that a number of years ago when I wrote a little book called Being Perfect. Every woman I know said, "Oh, that book." Every man I met said, "What's that about?" Eventually, that reaction led me to go on the Today Show and say that if I ever wrote a companion book for guys, I would call it Being Adequate. "Can you not say that?" said my husband, Columbia College class of '74. The guy who once said, "Could you get up and get me a beer without writing about it?" My best line is his. I actually started to think about the perfection complex most consistently once my kids were born. When I thought about how I was raising them and contrasted it with how I'd been raised. There was a kind of a careless imperfection to my childhood. I wandered away from time to time. I rode my bike too far from home. I took the trolley to nowhere in particular and back again. If you'd asked my mother at any given time where I was, she probably would have paused from spooning Gerber's peas into the mouth of yet another baby and replied, "She's around here somewhere." Well, by our current standards of mothering, my mother was a bust. I mean, given the number of times I got lost when I was young, people might even say she was neglectful. There's only one problem with that conclusion. It's completely wrong. My mother was great at what she did. Now, don't misunderstand me. She never sat on the floor and helped us build with our erector sets. She didn't haul us from the skating rink to piano lessons. She couldn't even drive. But where she was always felt like a safe place. The idea that that's a tough sell in our current culture is so disconcerting. But we do live in a kind of a perfection society now in which it's possible to make our bodies last longer, to manipulate our faces so that the lines of laughter and distress are wiped out. We believe in the illusion of control. And nowhere has that become more powerful and more pernicious than in the phenomenon of manic motherhood. What the psychologist D.W. Winnicott once called the ordinary good mother is no longer good enough. Instead, what you see is the uber mom who bounces from soccer field to school fair to play date until she falls into bed at the end of the day, exhausted, her life somewhere between the Stations of the Cross and a decathlon. Modern motherhood during our lifetime has been codified as an exercise in perfection and as a profession. It's been professionalized for women who don't work for pay outside the home, because if they're giving up such great opportunities, then the tending of kids needs to be a really serious job. And it's been professionalized for women who have paying jobs out in the world, because to show that their work isn't bad for their kids, they have to take child rearing as seriously as they do deal making. Well, it's not just at baking for the bake sale, meeting with the teachers, calling the other mother about the sleepover, and looking for the right, I can't even believe I have to say, the right SAT camp. Makes women of both sorts crazy. A lot of this is not particularly good for kids. If your mother has been micromanaging your homework since you were 6 years old, it's hard to feel any pride of ownership when you do well. You can't learn from mistakes and disappointments if your entire childhood is engineered so there aren't any. So much has been written about how the young people of America seem to stay young longer now, well into the years when their grandparents owned houses or had families. But their grandparents, count on it, never had a mother calling the teacher to complain about a bad grade. And hair-trigger attention spans may be less a function of computer use and more a function of kids who never have a moment's peace. Because I believe that downtime is where creativity grows, certainly it's true for me, I passed on the weekend rondelay of Kitty League sports so our three could hang out with one another. I told people I hoped it would cement a close bond among them, and the truth is it did. But I really wanted to be reading rather than standing on the sideline of a soccer field. I think I had 3 children in the first place so that I would never have to play board games. All of this craziness sounds improbable in the face of the women's movement that transformed the landscape of America during our lifetime, but at some level, I believe it's the fruit of that revolution. It's a comeuppance cleverly disguised as a calling. How better, should I answer that? How better to circumvent the power of the new woman than with the idea of mothering not as care but as full-time creation. Every moment for children was a teachable moment, and every teachable moment missed was the measure of a lousy mother. Now, I say mother and not father because dads still are not held to the same standards. It is still true that when a guy changes a diaper, his mother-in-law will act as though he invented fire. And frequently, when he takes care of his own children, it will be referred to as, thank you. It is really funny, given how much things have changed, that men often have not had to deal with the same expectations or demands that we have, even in a changed world. It's a world that still permits them to live relatively unexamined lives in terms of how they see themselves. I mean, you've never seen the cover line on Esquire magazine, "Lose 5 pounds in 5 days." But the interesting thing that I came to when I was working on my memoir is that in some ways this actually makes aging more challenging for men, because the constant loop of self-criticism doesn't end when they're older the way it does for us. It sort of begins there. They wake up at 60 and often find themselves flabbergasted if they're not masters of the universe. We didn't expect to be masters of the universe, so women of my generation have often found ourselves a bit surprised at reaching a high rung on the ladder, which is why we always talk about luck so often when we talk about our own accomplishments. It's so interesting deconstructing what happens to all of us when we age, and yet it's so funny how realizing that you're the person of a certain age comes on suddenly, a kind of a surprise. It came to me full force on a day in July some years ago when a tornado struck our house in Pennsylvania. I sent all 3 of our kids email messages. Christopher was in Germany at a heavy metal festival, and he didn't get his for 4 days. Quinn was in New York and wrote back immediately asking whether he should come and help me out. But Maria left her summer school class over at Columbia and called me sobbing. Because she knows that my own mother died when I was a student here, she spit out, "I'm just so afraid of history repeating itself." And without thinking, I responded, "Oh, honey, I'm too old to die young now." Sometimes there are things that come out of your mouth and they amount to an epiphany, even if they sound like a bad country western song. This was one of those things. I mean, I am no longer young, but I don't think I'm elderly. I'm at the midpoint of my life. I'm at a good point in my life. What point am I at? Am I old? Well, define your terms. One afternoon, I went a little ballistic when I read a newspaper story that described an elderly woman fending off a burglar. She was 68. "How is that elderly?" I said. "That's not elderly. 68 is not elderly." And in the silence afterwards, one of my kids said, "Mom, that's totally elderly." When I went back and searched my own clippings over the course of a long career in journalism for the word elderly, I discovered to my horror that I had used it with casual regularity. There were the elderly men on the boardwalk in Coney Island. There were the elderly women in the beauty parlors of Flatbush. And then, here's the important thing. The number of uses of the word elderly in my copy began to dwindle. and then die entirely. As I aged myself, elderly seemed more and more like a pejorative, and my definition of what constituted elderly shifted up. I guess old is wherever you haven't gotten to yet. And 60 is the new 40, as I'm sure you've heard. And you're only as young as you feel, and everyone feels, surprise, younger than they actually are. My hairdresser has this theory about what she calls resting hair rate. It's similar to your resting heart rate, except it means that no matter what you do to your hair, it will resolve itself into some general style that's its fallback position. I actually believe in resting weight rate. I mean, if you're exercising pretty regularly and eating like a normal person, there's some weight that your body will just normally adopt. So maybe there's a resting age rate. That is the age that you intuitively feel. According to one study, most adults over 50 feel at least 10 years younger than their actual age. I think if you woke me from a sound sleep and shouted, "How old are you?" I'd mutter 41. Now, it's interesting for me to consider that that's my resting age rate, and then to compare that time in my life to this one. My life was good at 41. I had published a novel, I was writing a newspaper column, and I had 3 children in all-day school for the first time. I had just started to work out for the first time in my life, which turned out to be good, and I occasionally found myself squinting at my book, which turned out to be not so good. Kevin Bacon, the actor, says that the good news is that your eyes and your face go at the same time so you can't see how you look. I had most of the friends I have today, and I had the same husband. My life was a little crazy, it's true. Sometimes I had to edit a column while the kids were having dinner, which meant that there were too many slapdash meals and run-on sentences. Sometimes I even had to interrupt dinner to take calls. I remember the day our son Christopher came downstairs and said, "Some man just called on your office phone, but I told him you couldn't talk because you were making dinner." That man was Jesse Jackson. Working at home is great. Well, it's nearly 2 decades later, and I still work at home, but the children no longer live there, although their rooms are preserved as shrines. And they stop in sometimes to raid the fridge. I've published a number of novels, had another column but gave it up, have added a few friends despite my insistence that I don't have room for any more friends. And if you woke me from a sound sleep and shouted, "How's 62 looking?" I would say really good. Better in many ways than 41. Now, the natural world and the modern one tells us a different story, a story about women who are past it because they're no longer fecund, no longer fertile, no longer alluring to men in the same way they were when they were 22. As the actress Lillian Gish once said, "You know, when I first went into the movies, Lionel Barrymore played my grandfather. Later, he played my father. And finally, he played my husband. If he had lived, I'm sure I would have played his mother." That's the way it is in Hollywood. The men get younger and the women get older. Except that the most bankable actress in Hollywood in the last 10 years was named Meryl Streep. And as she would be happy to tell you, and Paul McCartney sang to her last year, she is 64. Of course, part of getting older, and this is an important part, which I must admit I've been kind of good at, is learning to step aside. In fact, to face some of the disdain from younger women that our mothers once faced from us. I remember at one college a couple of years ago, a smart young woman stood up and told me very pugnaciously that she was going to be marrying early, having kids quickly, staying home to care for them in the way only a mother could, entering the workplace afterwards. She said she and her friends had heard quite enough about epidemic infertility, nanny horror stories, and the difficulties of finding a partner later in life. She said, to some applause, they would not make the same mistakes we did. Karma is a boomerang and a bitch. Well, there's some truth in that. I mean, we're part of a generation that said we wanted to change the world, and we did. We insisted we wanted more than our mothers had, and we got it. We let the 40-hour work week morph into the 60-hour work week and even the 80-hour work week. And in between those hours at the desk, we had those hours in the kitchen and the car, overseeing homework, making the rounds of those athletic fields. For those of us who feared as girls that our lives would be empty and boring, the crazed timpani of our existences at least meant that we were not in some cul-de-sac, but I'm not sure if we were being honest, we would consider our alternative completely ideal. I've developed a certain comfort level with the criticisms of those young women who want to make a different sort of life for themselves. If their experience of their exhausted, insomniac, dispirited elders makes them decide they'd prefer not to go straight from the classroom to the cubicle to the coffin, it doesn't necessarily mean they're ungrateful. Maybe it means they're sane. And sooner or later, I'm sure, they're going to understand what a legacy we've left them. They're the daughters of such extraordinary progress during our lifetime. It seems to me that sometimes there's a sweet spot in our own lives individually and in society generally when custom and change dovetail precisely, when the lessons of the past combine with the gains of the present to produce a possibly spectacular future. And by that, I'm not simply talking about the fact that there is now in Washington an oil painting of 4 female Supreme Court justices, where during my college years there would have been none, or the public conversations about the behavior of successful CEOs who have just given birth assume that female CEOs actually exist and that some of them will even have kids. None of that seems aberrational to the Barnard and Columbia women on these 2 campuses. They've grown up in a world in which they see women doing virtually everything. In fact, that became so clear to me one night when I was watching the news, watching Secretary Clinton give a press conference with my daughter Maria, who is really smart and well-informed, and she looked at Hillary on the screen and said, "Mama, has a man ever been Secretary of State?" Totally different upbringing. But if being a woman today meant simply having resume power, then being a woman today would mean more or less being a successful man. What's happened instead, it seems to me, is that the skills we developed over centuries when we weren't allowed to do much outside the home have intersected with new opportunities in the world to create an entirely new kind of woman who can make up her life as she goes along and change it up whenever she dares, which makes aging so much more interesting. All of those generations of sitting by the fireside have paid off. Generations of women watched and chatted, learned to parse human nature, and to drill down deep into what makes people tick. And so women learned to talk with, live with, and work with others. Generations of women counted their household pennies and made soup out of what was left of the chicken and dishcloths out of what was left of the curtains. And so women learned to be inventive about doing more with less. Generations of women were house-proud and housebound, raising girl children to do the same and boy children to do more. And so women learned to create a universe in the home to teach and to nurture and to stoke a small fire of anger. You take all those attributes out in the world, and it's amazing how well they work. Listening, learning, encouraging, those are the skills that translate beautifully to executive suites, state houses, schools, hospitals, and the White House too. And they're also the skills people have been saying they want to see in those settings for years and years. In other words, we women today come bearing what people want and need. And our girls born into such a changed atmosphere. But it's not just the opportunity to prosper, to achieve, to be taken seriously, to be paid attention, all those things that I wanted so much when I was a Barnard student. It's not just the opportunity to imitate the world of guys, which frankly hasn't served even guys very well. It's so much more than that. It's the opportunity to combine freedom with meaning, domesticity with work. It's the opportunity to take what women have done for centuries, what women have been obliged to do for centuries, and use it all in new ways. And it's the opportunity for our male colleagues and friends and loved ones to also eschew the old conventions of masculinity, the narrow brown boxes in which their characters were too often constrained. Because we didn't want to just change the world for our daughters, we wanted to change it for our sons as well. And if the stiletto heel is an instrument of torture, and I can attest that it is, then a tie is only a noose with a nice pattern. They may be different, but both illuminate one-size-fits-all gender stereotypes. You know, when I'm thinking about the span of my life and the changes in the lives of women that have accompanied them, I think often of Kitty O'Donnell Quindlen. My grandmother's greatest act of rebellion was, of all things, to wear a one-piece bathing suit on the beach in Atlantic City. At the time, some women saw that as a political act. A church excursion in New York Harbor on an old steamer had ended in 1904 with the drowning of 1,000 people, almost all of them girls and women. And there was talk afterwards that it was because women never learned to swim. They couldn't learn to swim in the wool dress and bloomer combos that public modesty then required. An Australian female distance swimmer was busted in Boston for wearing a one-piece suit and told the judge at her trial, "What difference is there from these legal costumes than wearing lead chains around our legs?" Now, I'd be really surprised if my grandmother was trying to strike a blow for women's rights when she wore her suit, which she always used to say almost got her arrested too. She considered herself a bit of a babe, and that probably had more to do with the swimwear. But she was also a nice Irish Catholic girl, and the fact that she talked about that incident her whole life long makes me think it was one of her only chances to color outside the lines of a circumscribed life. It's not that today's girls get to color outside the lines. It's that there aren't any lines anymore. I mean, they're engaged in the greatest act of rebellion, inventing themselves from the ground up. It was almost impossible to do that for my mother's generation. It was a challenge for mine. But for today's women, it is how things work. Our students, they are the heiresses to all of the above. Getting older has meant living long enough to see that glory. Virginia Woolf once said, "For most of history, Anonymous was a woman." Not anymore. Thank you very much. Thank you. Please sit down. Thank you so much. Thank you. Please sit down. Please. Thank you so much. Thank you. You are a fantastic audience, and just always keep in mind, if you learned anything from that speech, that that's what a Barnard education does for a woman. I believe we have some of our fabulous students holding microphones, so if any of you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of them will run up to you. Here she comes.
Abby Pariser, Barnard 67. You talked about the life expectancy when you were born and now. And was that a combination of men and women or just men's life expectancy?
No, that's a combination of men and women.
Okay, so now the FDA and all those people are saying you got to test women on all these drugs that you usually test men. Isn't it about time?
Absolutely. I mean, in part because of the community that you're going to be treating for healthcare issues, but actually I recall the breakdown men and women on that number, and while it was higher for women the same way it is today, it wasn't much higher. I think the number was between 70 and 71. And I just think that's astonishing because, you know, a life expectancy of 68, when we have a friend now who becomes ill and dies at 68, our universal reaction is so young. And just during the course of our lifetimes, for that to have changed so much, it bespeaks, you know, there's that famous Fitzgerald line, there are no second acts in American lives. But we're not at second acts, we're at fourth or fifth acts at this point. And that's both a little disconcerting when you're making it up as you go along and tremendously exciting.
Over here, sorry.
Thanks.
My name is Michelle, and I went to graduate school actually at Columbia. I found myself so often during those wonderful remarks wishing I was sitting here with my daughter and with my mother, and even with my son and my father. And I'm just wondering, will those remarks be published anywhere in a Barnard publication online? If I didn't even go to Barnard, so I don't know if I can ask this, but if they could be.
You can ask us anything. We are a completely inclusive community.
So that's my request. I think that many of us would love to share them with people.
Did we tape them? Oh yeah, we taped them. We'll transcribe them. We'll put them someplace where you can get them. I have no proprietary attitude towards my words, unless Amazon is trying to keep you from reading them. And along those lines, with no question, let me just make this little pitch here. None of you should buy books from any place, from Amazon online. You should buy them from BNN.com, you should buy them from iBooks, you should buy them from one of the other vendors, because Amazon has presented itself as someone who is interested in connecting authors and readers, and by their decision to either not vend books by one publishing house, Hachette, which includes Little Brown and Grand Central, which both have fabulous writers, or to slow down delivery of those same books, they're showing that they're not in the corner of either writers or readers. So until this dispute is settled to the benefit of readers, please buy elsewhere.
Hello. Hi. My name is Caitlin, class of '99, and actually my mom is here with me. Thank you so much for everything you said. I wanted to find out, get your take on the fact that I'm about to be 37 years old, and I have found that despite my feeling that women in the workplace should be very supportive of one another and lift each other up and help each other achieve their goals, women have actually been the biggest impediment to me in the workplace, much more so than men.
I get asked that question a lot, and along with the contention that women in the workplace have been a bar to the advancement of other women, it totally was never my experience. I mean, I'm here because of women. I got hired at the New York Times when I was a 24-year-old tabloid reporter, and in the same way that I convinced myself before I arrived at Barnard that I was the smartest girl in America, and then was completely disabused of the notion in my first English seminar. I convinced myself that I was the best little reporter in New York, and then it turned out that 6 really brave women had brought suit against the New York Times, charging that it didn't hire, promote, or pay women in parity with men. Virtually my entire career at the Times owed something, if not most things, to the efforts of those women. And as a woman who rose at the paper, I took as my mantra, rise up, reach back. And there is a whole group of younger women who feel a certain level of gratitude to me for that, and that was partly self-interest because when I'm yesterday's news, they'll give me work. But I actually feel like women have been very supportive to me, and one of the things I say to younger women all the time is, given the changes and the span of history in terms of the lives of women in which we've lived, you have a moral obligation to bring your talented sisters along. I'm not talking about doing anybody a favor. You know, I was an affirmative action hire at the New York Times. I say that all the time because the right has hijacked that term and made it into something it's not. They've made it into hiring the third rate, and if you think this is the third rate, then maybe they're right. But what it really means is opening doors that were locked against some of us so that we can walk on through them. Just like I always say, I am a liberal. I like the term progressive, but the only reason we're using progressive now is because the right hijacked the term liberal. And I'm not going to let them define what I am. I am a liberal. And finally, and in some ways most important, I am proudly a feminist. And that should be true not only of women, but of men. You know, we have this great T-shirt at the Barnard Women's Center, and it says on the front, "Dare to use the F word." And then on the back, it says feminist. And I gave that T-shirt to our son, Christopher. And one day he came home from college, and he had on the T-shirt, and I was like, "So you're wearing the T-shirt?" And he said, "Mom, I wear this T-shirt all the time." And I was like, "Really? You wear that T-shirt all the time?" And he goes, "Yeah, chicks dig it." So there you go. Who's got the mic?
Feminist?
I have 2 sons and a daughter, and absolutely both my sons are feminists.
Well,
and
my sons are feminists also.
Well,
and they do most of the cooking because they like it.
Well, I don't think we've gotten to that point yet. Quinn is kind of more of a sous chef than a chef. But I will say that they have great female friends and have been involved with great women. And I think that's because women really do like it when you treat them as co-citizens on the planet. And both of our guys are like that. Having said that, at one point they told me that they didn't always find it easy. You know, I think one of them said it was a little bit like growing up with one layer of your skin stripped off, because everybody else felt such latitude to do the bro thing. And they didn't in quite the same way. Raising Maria as a feminist was really easy. She's totally pissed off at anybody who doesn't take her 100% seriously, and she just carried that out into the world.
Hi, I'm Columbia, class of '64. Could you talk about the atmosphere at the Times towards women reporters when you were there, and to the extent that you know since then?
Newspapers tend to be meritocracies because they can be. We did then produce an entirely new product every 24 hours. And when you're working on that kind of schedule, at a certain point it becomes, can you deliver? I remember my colleague Russell Baker once telling me when I became an op-ed page columnist that the most important thing was the meritocracy of the readership. In other words, at some level, it wouldn't matter what your bosses thought of you. if the readers kept somehow communicating that they liked what you did. And that stood me in very good stead when for 3 years I did a column called Life in the 30s. There were some of the problems that there are for women everywhere, but what I found is that institutions that are more low rent and low pay are kinder to outsiders than ones that have a high level of respect and remuneration, which is why people tell me all the time that Wall Street is still deeply, deeply male and misogynist, and most newspapers aren't. The Times still has a ways to go in terms of parity. I mean, when I was there, I was the only woman on the op-ed page. Today, there are 2 women on the op-ed page. There should be 4 or 5 women on the op-ed page. But I felt like a newspaper in that hustle and bustle, that sense of Quindlen, can you deliver the copy, was more welcoming to me than the institutions of medicine or law or business in which many of my friends worked. And I think that's true, even truer today, because there are many young women in management positions and as reporters at the Times who are sort of spectacularly talented. And before we get the follow-up question, I will not address myself to Jill's situation, in part because I know and like very much all the people involved in that situation, and in part because I think, like most people, I don't know all the information, I don't know all the facts, and I don't like to opine until all facts are in evidence. But I will say one thing. I haven't worked at the New York Times for almost 20 years, but I still consider myself a Times woman. And I'm very proud to say that because the paper is and will continue to be the gold standard of American journalism, both in its online presence and in its printed product. Some great institutions have what I think of as the inertia of excellence. That is, they're so good in all their small component parts that even when something goes wrong, something very large sometimes in the public sphere, the Jason Blair debacle at the Times of some years ago, what's just happened in the newsroom, the product continues day after day, year after year to be excellent, and that's true of the Times, and it's why I'm still so proud to have been affiliated with it. Who's got the mic? Stand up.
Hi, Anna. How are you? How do we take back the word feminist and feminism for our young girls today?
Use it all the time. Use it all the time and talk about what it really means. You know, talk about the fact that it means people being judged by their abilities and their inclinations and not simply their gender. Shoot down the big lies about it. That, you know, I always go out there on college campuses and I'm like, hey, mascara, skirt, husband, children, feminist. Because the big lie is supposed to have something to do with hating men and you know, this and that and everything. It's just such errant nonsense. I mean, if anything, I think in terms of broadening and breaking open sex roles, that feminist politics have only benefited men. Because when you look back to the gender roles that we once conformed to, the ones that men were required to conform to were every bit as punishing, if not more punishing, than the ones we were required to conform to. So the idea that you don't only have to pursue a life in the home can be really liberating. And the idea that you don't always only have to be the sole breadwinner for a family can be really liberating too. And you know, I think feminism is about the great variety of human beings and how we should each get to be who we authentically are, as opposed to playing some gender role that's set out by some great they out there that on all subjects seems to have no idea what it's doing and has no moral compass. I'm not listening to they anymore. They don't have a clue. I would be fine about the word humanist if we started with a level playing field, but we don't. So when we get to all the different ways in which we can assess that, if we get to 51 female senators, if we get to Pope Brittany the First, if you have a meeting of the Fortune 500 CEOs and 250 of them are female, then I'll start talking about humanism. But you know, the humanism thing is a little bit of a bait and switch to suggest that we've somehow reached a post-feminist age. Look at what's happening to the schoolgirls in Nigeria. We're not post-feminist. Look at the kid in California who went out and just shot people up because he said girls wouldn't date him. We're not post-feminist. Look at the sexual assault problems on college campuses across this country being handled by the college campuses. Can you imagine any college or university saying, well, you know, we had a murder on campus, but we'll handle that ourselves? Not post-feminist. So when we get post-feminist, we'll talk about humanism, and by then I'll be long gone, and my daughter can argue this point.
Hi, my name is Rose Minitaglio. I'm interning at Sports Illustrated this summer, and I was just wondering if you had any advice for someone starting out in the world of journalism and communications.
I mean, journalism is hard right now because you sort of have to take it where you can get it. It depends on whether you're safe or not. Now, what do I mean by that? Sometimes you get a job and you are good enough about it right off the bat that they really figure out they need you. And when they need you, you need to push things a little farther. I mean, there came a point at the New York Times where I was kind of the designated woman, and that meant that when I thought they were doing things that were bad for women, I sort of went, But a lot of people don't wind up in that position. So I think you just have to step up and really do the work. You know, really do the very best work that you can. I know it's controversial because we're supposed to be who we are, but one of my pieces of advice to women in the workplace always has to be, do not cry where anyone can see you. It's still considered like a girl thing, and to the extent that anybody's looking out for the girl thing that makes you less, you just don't want to give them that. I would say, you know, that we have to present ourselves in a slightly different way than our male colleagues in terms of demeanor and dress, but I am the young New York Post reporter about whom some veteran reporters will still say the first time she was ever at a press conference with me, she was wearing hot pants and platform shoes. And unfortunately, that's accurate. It was a different time. But you know, just do it. And if there are women in the workplace who are willing to befriend you, to help you, to give you the lay of the land, you know, make friends. I mean, my very best friend in the whole world is somebody who was hired at the Times at the same time I was in response to the lawsuit, and we became friends because I saw her walking across a newsroom in which she was the only woman, and I ran up to her and said, "Hi, I'm Anna Quindlen," and we've been friends ever since. So, I mean, making those kinds of connections is really important. Here's the other thing, and Sylviane Hewlett, who used to teach here, has written a really interesting book about it. People ask all the time about mentors. Did I have mentors? Did I mentor people? I always try to fudge the answer because the truth is, in real ways that's meant, I didn't have mentors. I had something different. Mentors help you along out of the goodness of their hearts. There's not as much goodness of their hearts in the workplace as you would like to think. Sponsors help you along because it's going to make them look good. They identify you as talented and hardworking, and they think, wow, if I push her along, in 3 or 4 years, somebody's going to be saying, this is the person who discovered, you know, whatever. I had lots of sponsors. And while most of my colleagues and the people that I turned to for support were female, most of my sponsors were male. They thought that they would get, you know, the first woman, whatever, and so on and so forth. I would look for sponsors rather than mentors, the kind of people who are interested in promoting your career because it helps promote their own.
Anna, I'm Leanne Chung, Engineering 88 from Sarasota, Florida. I just started a recent fun blog on Huffington Post, so I was just wondering, what do you think made people read your op-eds and kept them captivated to continue reading your columns?
There's a weird kind of columnist DNA that I've discovered over the years. And I've discovered it because I've had some friends and colleagues who were enormously talented reporters and writers and not very good columnists. And I just kept thinking, what is it? What's the alchemy? I think a good columnist creates a persona. And that what happens is that the reader learns to know and like the persona. Ideally, with a really good columnist, if you took their byline off, if I took the byline off of any Gail Collins column, I would know it was a Gail Collins column because she's created a voice and a persona that I happen to really love, but it's also identifiable. I think that happened with me, that I was able to craft this kind of persona. But I was also able to craft it as an op-ed page columnist, having come out of life in the 30s, a column in which I gained a loyal readership of women who felt that the New York Times had not reflected their lives, particularly their domestic lives, in its pages, and who suddenly said, who is this woman? And they sort of followed me, and I think the end result is that I wound up with this incredibly loyal cadre of people who liked the column and felt they were getting something out of the column. The important thing for me always to say is, as much as they got out of reading it, I got even more out of them reading it. Because I think I think the single most important thing that reading does for all of us, particularly in a society like ours, is it shows you you're not alone. And to the extent that there were these women out there reading the column and then writing to me or coming up to me on the street, I felt less alone. And in our culture, that's an affirmative good, and I think maybe it was the linchpin of the whole thing. I'm afraid I can only take one more. So fight among yourselves. Oh, somebody's already got the mic.
Okay, Laura Giffner, class of 1969. You used the word sponsors, and I would like to use the word role model. I think it's important for young men and women to have strong female role models. For example, my 12th grade social studies teacher had already read and digested The Feminine Mystique, and she was already wearing boots when it really wasn't a fashion item. And she said to us 17-year-olds, especially the young women, go to the best college you can go to, and she pushed me to go to Barnard. My mother-in-law had always worked. Therefore, my husband had no problems with me wanting to work either at home freelance or out in the workforce. And some of my friends are women in their 80s and early 90s, and I am impressed and encouraged because I see that if you keep yourself active and engaged, your mind won't go on you. You know, you can have a fulfilling life even in your 80s and 90s. Who were your role models?
Well, you just threw me kind of a softball here because it enables me to do a little sort of paid announcement that I try to do every time I speak. I am a writer because of teachers. It's as simple as that. I mean, when the second most powerful woman in your life, because for me the most powerful woman in my life was my mother, keep saying to you over and over again, you're good at this, you should keep doing it, here's an A, you're a writer. Huge. So, Mother Mary Ephraim in 8th grade, who was the first person to say to me, you are a writer. Jeanette Ritzenthaler, my senior year in high school, who said to me when I was running out to cheerleading practice, you are better than this. And Catherine Stimpson, my major advisor at Barnard College, who is one of the great women, one of the great teachers, who always treated me with such affection and respect, although I was a very conventional girl, and she was a very unconventional woman, and is still someone who I have such a strong relationship and an affinity with. I can't stress it enough. It's not one role model, it's an institution. Barnard changed my life. It made me think that I was a person of substance. It made me think not that I was permitted to have opinions, but that I was required to have them. It made me understand once and for all that anybody who said that women were less was simply lying. Thank you all very much.